How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're listening to DNA Today, a podcast and radio show where we discover new advances in the world of genetics. From genetic technology like CRISPR to rare diseases to new research, we have you covered. For a decade, DNA Today has brought you the voices of leaders in genetics. I'm Dineen. I'm a certified genetic counselor and your host. Are you a genetic counselor or genetic counseling student? Want to enter to win a $100 Amazon gift card? Participate in a quick survey this November to capture your insight on clinical trials. The goal of this study is to assess if, how, and when genetic counselors discuss clinical trials within their practice and document their process. Also, the researchers will look to define a framework for current genetic counselors to incorporate clinical trials into their own practice. It only took me about 15 minutes to fill it out. The link to the survey is in the show notes if you're listening to this in a podcast app, or available in the blog post for this episode at dnatoday.com. The principal investigator, Derek Ansell's email can be found there as well for questions you might have. After 2 years of virtual NSGC conferences, I can't wait to see many of you in Nashville next week. Say hi if you see me. If you want to be featured in our NSGC recap episode, let me know. I would love to capture your impression of the conference and what you've learned and feature this in the episode. And maybe you'll get some DNA Today merch in exchange. I'll be spending a lot of time in the exhibit hall, so look for me there. In this episode, we're exploring a topic that I talk about every day as a prenatal genetic counselor, family history in reproductive medicine. Joining me for this discussion is Dr. Tristan Hardy, who is a dual-trained OBGYN and genetic pathologist with a particular focus on reproductive genetics. So thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Hardy.
Thank you, Kira, for having me.
And we have quite the time difference going on here. So it's the first thing of my morning and the last thing of Dr. Hardy's day because you're based out of Australia, correct?
That's correct. It's very late in the evening here, but any time is a good time to talk about genetics.
You know, I agree with that. You know, little bias having a genetics podcast, but definitely. So I thought in our conversation, we could start out talking about when family history is actually relevant to reproductive health and what some general trends are for people to keep in mind, you know, maybe before they go to see their genetic counselor or provider, OBGYN, you know, what should they think about in terms of biological family health history?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And from a reproductive medicine point of view, we often think of family history in two themes. I think that the first theme is what's common to genetic counseling is there a significant family history of a genetic condition? So someone that we know has a dominant condition in the family or children born with a recessive condition, and it allows you to do a risk assessment in the same way that a genetics clinic usually would. In reproductive medicine, though, we also focus on a fertility history, and often it's the fertility history of the parents. And we ask about, was there difficulty conceiving? Are there long gaps between siblings as a sign? You know, that used to be a sign of infertility, potentially a structural rearrangement of chromosomes that was unknown at the time in the family. Miscarriages, stillbirth, babies with congenital abnormalities, the same sorts of questions, but we're looking at it through a fertility lens. Is this relevant to the couple in front of us? And are we going to use that information to guide their care?
Yeah, so certainly helpful to know the patient's reproductive history and, as you said, any fertility issues that they've had over the years, miscarriages, and also their partner, especially if they've had different partners in the past, and that reproductive information. How about expanding out to other family members? A lot of people before their appointments will end up talking to parents, grandparents in terms of collecting that family history. Is it relevant to also know in terms of their mother, in terms of miscarriages, or grandmothers or sisters, aunts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on both sides of the family, one sort of common misconception is that people think of fertility as a gynecological issue, you know, something that only women need to know about and ask their mothers. But actually, when it comes to the sorts of genetic factors that can influence reproduction, we know that this can be on both sides of the families, and that there's particularly chromosome structural rearrangements might be carried by either a male or a female, and it may come down from either line in the family. So it might be actually the paternal grandmother's history of infertility and miscarriages, recurrent miscarriages. And as you go further back into the past, obviously there weren't technologies like IVF with preimplantation genetic testing to look for these things. And so it may just present in that way with really what would have been unexplained at the time. And then by the time that we see them, it may be that we actually find the explanation for what has been on either side of the family.
It can be challenging, especially when we go back that far, because, I mean, families tended to be bigger back in time, which is a great thing. We love big families in genetics. But also, medicine, as you said, wasn't where it is today. And so, stillbirths were much more common, infant death, and really family stories of sharing if multiple miscarriages happen. That may be something that isn't documented in the family or, was taboo to talk about. So I think that's an aspect that certainly affects being able to collect family history. And when you can, certainly great. I love when patients see me and they've done their homework and they're like, do you mind if I call my mom on the phone or my grandmother? I'm like, let's do it. Like, let's bring everybody into the conversation, which can really be great. And, as you're talking about, a lot of this fertility focus, for people and couples that are pursuing IVF, in vitro fertilization, or IUI, in uterine insemination, using a sperm donor or egg donor, what should they pay attention to in the donor profile? I mean, certainly the family history aspect of that donor profile, which they'll have a medical professional go over it with them, but just so they have a little heads up before they go into those appointments and start looking through, because profiles are very, very long. So it's a lot to sort through.
It is a lot to sort through, and the task really of comparing all of the information that's been given to you is a really difficult one. In Australia, it's actually very common for us to use the United States clinics, the donor clinics, because they're so prolific and they're so supportive of our programs. We actually find it very difficult in Australia to get clinic recruited donors. So it's particularly when it comes to sperm and also when it comes to eggs. So third-party reproduction in Australia, often we are accessing gametes from overseas, and I have to say that the United States programs are run to an extremely good quality. So one thing that you do see is, as you say, they're very long profiles, but it shows just how thorough it is. And in fact, one of the things that we tell patients is that the sperm donors they really are very highly selected, and there might be only 1 or 2% of the people who initially applied to be sperm donors in that program, and they've gone through a thorough genetic evaluation. So the American guidelines for donor for non-directed donor gametes really is they're focused on making sure that there's not a higher than population risk of a genetic condition. So if they have a significant medical condition themselves, a condition in the family that could be autosomal dominant inheritance, and then they're really excluded from those programs. They're not available for non-directed donation. But then they also have quite extensive screening now for autosomal recessive conditions. So typically for hundreds of conditions now, that presents us with some difficulty actually, as we have to keeping up to match to the donor profiles and always screen our recipient in the correct way. But as it stands, then there's the family history component. And when it comes to family history, the sorts of things that are left that are described are really things that tend to be what are polygenic, multifactorial. They may have environmental contributions. They might typically not have a genetic basis, but known to have a recurrence risk. So a family history of type 1 diabetes, for example, strangely comes down more on the paternal rather than maternal line. We say that there's about a 6% chance just off the cuff if it's the father that's affected versus a 2% chance for if it's a mother that's affected. No one quite knows the basis for that, but we know that is a common phenomenon. And there are lots of other conditions that only present later in life. So obviously donors, they're typically of a younger age, 20 to 30 perhaps. So it's only the family history of older adults in their family which might give an indication of other susceptibilities that they might have to later onset neurological conditions or cancers, etc. The thing is that at the end of the day, we are all subject to some family history. I mean, our relatives have to have something. So it is difficult to disentangle, but at least it's important to think of the fact that there has been a very strong screen for single gene conditions, and then the things that are left tend to be more polygenic and multifactorial.
Yeah, it's very well said that many conditions that are coming up when I'm taking a family history I'm going over, this is multifactorial. We think that genes are playing a role in this, environment's playing a role, and we're still learning both aspects of that and how much weighs in. And, as you said with the carrier screening, it's hard to keep up with. Like nowadays, I've been seeing, in 2022 here, a lot of donors end up having like a 500 condition panel is usually what I've seen, especially for the past couple months. Kind of went from 283 to now 502 is what I've been seeing. But, as you said, they're going to be identified as a carrier of something. I did a 500 condition panel. I was a carrier of a condition. That episode came out earlier this year. We talked about it. And so then you have to have the intended parents, if they're using one of their gametes, their sperm or egg, to match all of that. So it's definitely a lot to keep track of. And that these profiles are so long that, a lot of patients come in and say, I know more about this donor than I do my partner. And it's just so funny because that donor really sits down with the healthcare provider to gather all this information. And, it can be helpful, but as you said, hard to sort through. And such an astute point that donors are typically in their 20s, 30s, so we're not going to see later onset conditions in them, which makes the family history aspect for previous generations even more important. And interesting, I had no idea that for Australia, you guys really use a lot of, American donors and systems. So, I guess that makes sense with, yeah.
We're very familiar with a lot of American products, and that is one of them. Third party reproduction is really it's so supported by the wonderful systems that you have there actually, and I think you're well leading in that aspect as in many others, and it really does become overwhelming sometimes because they've been so thoroughly evaluated, and as you say, compared to someone that you might meet, fall in love with, and decide that you want to have a baby with them, it's a bit different. You don't actually grill them that much, really. You don't grill them with a professional genetic counselor by your side. So in terms of those things, they often come up slowly and maybe not with so much detail. And then the potential for you to switch donors and to look at the different profiles, I think that's another thing that's hard to get your head around sometimes.
Yeah, it definitely is. And when going through family history, I know a question that when I'm going through my questions that patients often ask about, why are you asking me this, is if there's a family history of early menopause. So usually a phrase if someone, stopped getting their periods in their early 40s, this can increase the risk for that person to be a Fragile X carrier. Why is this? Can you explain the phenomenon behind this in terms of what Fragile X is and what that inheritance pattern looks like, because it's a little more unique than what we've been talking about so far with recessive conditions. And we've touched on multifactorial conditions.
Yeah, so Fragile X is a really tricky one to talk to patients about. So Fragile X, when we're talking about what does Fragile X mean? Well, initially when we used to look down chromosomes at microscopes, or we still do, but the way in which it was identified was there was a small part of the X chromosome which was fragile. It looked like it had a little narrowing, and in these people it was visible, and they took this and they tried to work out what was the basis of it, and they found that Fragile X syndrome was found typically in males, but also in females who had a particular form of intellectual disability that would have particular facial features and particular elements of it that put it together as a syndrome. And they identified a gene called the FMR1 gene. And this gene is not unique, but it has sort of a particular flavor to it, and it's called a triplet repeat gene. And triplet repeat genes, I explain to my patients, you can think of the triplets at the beginning of the gene as sort of like the computer pausing before it uploads the program. So the gene itself is the program, and it needs to function well. And there's a little triplet repeat beforehand, which is kind of like that blue spinning wheel that you see sometimes when your computer isn't loading. And a triplet repeat that's a short duration, it means that spins for a little bit and then the program launches and everything's okay. Then there's a group of people who have what's called a premutation. And a premutation means that blue wheel spins for quite a while before the program loads, but the program does load. And so typically a female carrier of Fragile X has what's called a premutation. And we say in pathology terms, it's 55 to 200 repeats. But people with the full condition of Fragile X syndrome have more than 200 repeats. So what happens there is that blue wheel just keeps spinning and spinning and the program never loads. So they have some of the neurological features of Fragile X syndrome because the gene isn't loading at all, and typically typically males are more severely affected because they've only got one copy of the gene. They don't have a backup copy of the gene to load. But what's particularly challenging, especially in the fertility setting and people coming to us to request pre-implantation genetic testing for Fragile X, is we find that if you are a female with that premutation, that slow loading form of the program, you're also susceptible to a premature ovarian insufficiency. So that means going into menopause typically before the age of 40, but it means that even in the lead up to 40, you have a lower ovarian reserve and a lower response to IVF. So we typically collect fewer eggs. And the mechanism for that is complex. It's actually not the same as the gene not loading or being silenced. It's actually the fact that there's an RNA molecule or an intermediary which is somehow toxic to ovarian function and that leads to follicular degeneration earlier in life. So the mechanism isn't well known, but it's well demonstrated that if you're a Fragile X carrier, you can look at the ovarian reserve and 20 to 40% might go through menopause before the age of 40. But more importantly, if you're trying to reproduce naturally, it doesn't matter, you're releasing 1 egg per month. But when we come to an IVF cycle, we're trying to make lots of eggs and test embryos. And in this case, it's actually X-linked dominant. In the high-risk copy of the gene, we're ruling out 50% of the embryos on average. It really makes a difference, the fact that you've got a really low number of eggs. And one of the things that I've started talking to my patients about and talking to my referring clinicians is the concept of genetic fertility preservation. So we talk about fertility preservation, people freezing their eggs in the setting of a cancer diagnosis where they're going to take treatment that will impact on the ovarian function. And also we talk about fertility preservation for social reasons or elective egg preservation. So that saying that I don't know that I've met my partner yet, I want to make sure that by the time I get to the age at which I have children, I've got a good bank of eggs. So people might present at 30 to do that and to preserve their fertility. But when it comes to genetic conditions, people typically don't come in for egg freezing. But in fact, Fragile X would be probably the prime example of something that you can know from quite a young age, whether you're a Fragile X carrier. And in that case, you should be having a fertility discussion and thinking about freezing your eggs. And it's going to become particularly more relevant, especially if you're going to test embryos and before putting them back.
Yeah, I think as you said, this is such a good example of something that we can identify in family history and then explore further. And certainly when this does come up, I offer carrier screening to everybody. That includes if you're a Fragile X carrier, that's like very standard. That was one of the first conditions that was added. It was like in their core 3 with cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. Those were kind of the main 3 at the beginning. But yeah, it's certainly very relevant and a reason why family history is important to talk about. And I wanted to pull out something you said too about PGT, so pre-implantation genetic testing or screening. As we said at the beginning, you practice in Australia, which is correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the first countries in the world to have PGT broadly supported by government and health systems. And I was like really shocked when I learned this. And this was enacted, like 2 years ago, 2021-ish?
It's about one year ago now. We've
Okay.
had, it was the 1st of November, so it was actually just over a year ago.
Oh, just over a year ago. Wow. So how's that going so far? I mean, are patients eligible to have this covered cost-wise if there's an indication? Or is it just like considered like, oh, this is just general screening, you're going through IVF, let's just add this on?
So there's really 2 types of PGT in this regard, and we talk about pre-implantation genetic testing for monogenic conditions, or PGTM. So Fragile X would be one of them, but there's many as you've mentioned. And then we also talk about pre-implantation genetic testing for structural rearrangements. So a parent who has a structural rearrangement of the chromosomes that makes it difficult for them to make an egg or a sperm with the typical amount of DNA. And they're the indications of sort of the medical indications that are supported by the government funding. So when it comes to government funding in Australia, you have to be, you don't have to have a specific condition. There's no list of conditions as there are in some other countries, but you do have to be seen by a clinical geneticist and supported to have pre-implantation genetic testing for the condition that's been identified in you. It also covers people having exclusion testing, so you don't have to have the condition identified in you. So exclusion testing is where someone may have a family history of, say, Huntington's. They don't want to have testing themselves for it, but they know that they're at 50% risk of having the condition, and they can undergo IVF to make sure that they don't pass it on to their children, even if they are affected, without them finding out the answer. So that is also one of the ones that's covered. Preimplantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, on the other hand, is sort of the other main type of PGT. It's considered sort of an IVF add-on, or an additional treatment to try and improve the success rates from IVF. That's not covered by the government funding in Australia. So we've seen, we already had a very busy PGT program and lots of referrals, but there's nothing like some additional support for patients to actually undergo it. The other thing that we've had in Australia recently is really a nationwide carrier screening project called Mackenzie's Mission, or the Australian Reproductive Carrier Screening Project. And that was screening for over 1,000 genes. And for anyone who screened positive, they were, as a couple, as if they were high risk, they were eligible for a funded round of IVF with preimplantation genetic testing. And I suppose the aim of the project was to try and identify, what decisions do couples make if their decisions aren't guided by financial measures. So typically prenatal testing in Australia was actually funded by the government, but IVF and PGT wasn't, because of the setting in which it's performed. And they tried to equalise that and show that actually it was a very acceptable reproductive option for people in that situation.
Wow. Well, I really hope other countries follow in your lead. I mean, we certainly don't have that extension of coverage. Insurance sometimes will cover certain things, from my understanding, and it definitely depends on what someone's insurance is. I mean, America's healthcare system is kind of crazy. But, I think it's such a cool program. Like, I had never heard of this before. And I think hopefully other countries can look at how successful this has been and say, okay, how can we do this now that we have, a role model for being able to follow this? And, wow, 1,000 conditions. I've never heard of a, genetic test that covers, for carrier screening. That's 1,000 conditions. I imagine people come up with a slew of that they're carriers for different conditions on there.
Absolutely. As part of the project, they actually only reported if you were in a high risk scenario. So that was one of the tricks. And you think of reproductive carrier screening as something that is actually only relevant at that time to that reproductive pairing. And it's probably a good way to pitch it, rather than individual carrier status, because as we get bigger and bigger in our gene lists, we're going to have more and more counselling time to discuss it. But the expectation being, we are all carriers of errors in our genetic code. It's not an issue in most cases. So if you elect to have incidental health findings, you might want to have that information. But for the majority, you don't need to know it unless it's relevant. It's just in time. And I think that might be the way in which carrier screening goes. As it gets more complicated, we might have to simplify it back again.
Yeah, I can definitely see that being applicable, because I'm calling people and saying, hey, you're a carer of this. Like, I expected you to come back for something. Like, you kind of have to do the whole spiel every time. And, that's genetic counseling. But yeah, as you said, unless it's one of those rare conditions where carriers can have symptoms themselves, it's not really relevant. If their partner, and that's going to be their reproductive partner in the future, is not a carrier of the same condition. And it's not one of these like Fragile X that we talked about, where males aren't a carrier for, it's just females. So that and Duchenne muscular dystrophy would be like the two exceptions in my mind for that. But yeah, everybody else, that's a really good point. Like, we don't need to dive into the details. Like, we can just be like, okay, is this an at-risk couple or not? And really only relevant if that person is seeking sperm or egg donor to be like, okay, matching, like we talked about earlier. And, another question that I get a lot when I'm doing family history, I ask if the person and their partner, if they are both the biological parents, if they're related in any way, if they're cousins, which most people end up kind of chuckling at and saying absolutely not. But certainly, in America, this isn't as common as other areas of the world. Why is it important for me to be asking this if partners are what we call consanguineous?
So consanguinity really just increases the chance that you are a match or a reproductive pairing where you both carry the same area in the gene. And the reason you carry the same area in the gene is because you had a common ancestor not that long ago. And so that they've passed that down to both of you on each side of the family. And we find that because in our particular method of PGT that's used worldwide called carrier mapping, it's a form of DNA fingerprinting. And when you use DNA fingerprinting in embryos, you see that consanguinity consanguinity really reduces the amount of information available, because we compare DNA fingerprints between embryos, and we can see it not only between the couple, but if you are the product of a consanguineous relationship. So if there's consanguinity in the family tree on one side, you do see it. So it certainly increases your chance of having a single gene condition between you. And some people are saying now that if you were to do a sort of a whole exome-based approach to carrier screening for couples and report on areas in which they have the same copies of the genes, the ones that you can identify have a common ancestor, that there might be up to a 20% high risk couple rate when viewed at sort of that level. And so some of the publications from one of my colleagues locally and did the work in Europe and showed that actually really the reproductive risk, rather than maybe 2 to 3%, is what we usually quote couples who are undergoing expanded carrier screening, which, as you said, used to be 300, maybe now it's 500, but that sort of scale. But if we look at the 20,000 genes and take a pair who have a common ancestor, it might be something like 20%, which would be really it'd be game changing if we were doing that routinely. It would be very difficult work in the laboratory and also from a counseling perspective, but it might be really important information for them.
Yeah, that'd be very interesting if when we get to a point where whole genome sequencing is really just looked at as like preventative care, and that people are just getting that at a certain age, or even like that replaces newborn screening way down the line, especially in, Australia, the United States, developed countries. And then that follows you. And so, looking at that in terms of a carrier screening perspective, oh my gosh, I'd have to have a long appointment to talk about that with patients. I can't imagine. But, we've been talking about really focus on the family history in this episode and what's relevant and what ends up leading to different testing. And taking family history has definitely changed over time. That paper pencil model is really being phased out, especially with so many places using electronic health record systems. How are digital pedigrees aiding in patient care, specifically for you in your practice?
So I agree that the paper pencil pedigree is phasing out, but we still do love to do it in front of a patient, because there's nothing like taking history and scribbling on a piece of paper. Same thing as I draw terrible diagrams for my patients as I explain IVF and PGT. But when it comes to digital pedigrees, though, what I've been working with the TrackGene team, and we're trying to make TrackGene more fertility and PGT relevant. So we're trying to make some modules that are really for the fertility clinic. It doesn't necessarily have the genetics expertise of a traditional clinical genetics service, but trying to get it out where these issues are extremely important. I think OBGYNs and REIs in particular, reproductive endocrinology and fertility specialists, they have a role in promoting genetic health and providing access to relevant testing. So taking a family history, urging the importance of carrier screening and taking patients through that. And so what we're trying to do is to automate some of that. So we have an automated digital family history questionnaire that can be done, and basically the patient can construct their own family history beforehand, and then we're working to update that so that we can have different modules and different situations, because in the IVF clinic, as we've already alluded to, we're not talking about the traditional square and circle meeting each other on a pedigree. We're going to be using lots of different sources of gametes, so we might need to incorporate that donor family history and genetic testing results into their family tree or their pedigree. We might need to have ways of showing that and doing it in a friendly manner that can suit OBGYNs and the patients who are going through the treatment.
Yeah, I think very well said. And this is where the future is going, especially as you said, with, patients sometimes being able to fill out information ahead of time that can auto-populate pedigrees. And then you're more going in and adding more details, but you have this structure and template to start from. And what's great is that can follow a patient and can be uploaded into an EMR. And, as we talked about our scribbles and everything, like my handwriting is terrible. So, I know in my personal practice that's very small, OBGYN with one doctor, I'm the only one that's reading the pedigree, because I end up writing a consult note that kind of actually writes out and types, in a nice font and everything. But I can scribble and it's fine. But if I was working for a big institution where that pedigree is being, if I was drawing it scanned in and put into an EMR, good luck to people to read it. So I think it's really great that we're able to do that. And as you said, really important to integrate, especially in the IVF, IUI setting, of including the donor's information. And I imagine too, being able to link certain profiles, and if an issue does come up of looking at, oh, this donor, we just learned that their mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 45. That's going to be a really big deal, right? That's a red flag for hereditary cancer, which we haven't talked about in this episode because we're focused on reproductive genetics, but that could be really helpful in terms of then being able to update all of those pedigrees. And really the possibilities are endless. I think digital pedigrees, like, we're going to kind of laugh at, it's going to date us, I think, at some point in our career to be like, back in our day, we used to draw the pedigrees,
Yeah, absolutely. You'll miss flicking through someone's file in a hospital, and there's nothing like a quick flick through to see what's happening. You can't do that with a computer, but you certainly can do some good work. I think the point that you made about donors is really interesting. We get notifications when a donor has a child with a rare genetic condition, and whilst they might be screened for 200, 300, 500 conditions, there's plenty of rare genetic conditions out there that you don't know about until that donor's gamete meets someone who also is a carrier of that condition, and that's identified. And unlike a traditional pedigree, that donor might be present in many of our pedigrees in our practice and may need to be updated across those pedigrees, and then all of those people contacted to have updated genetic testing to assess their reproductive risk. And so that's something that you really have to be flexible about. It's a very, very different setting that we're in.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, I could talk to you all day / night for you about, family history, and just so important. I think shockingly, after 200 plus episodes, we've never had an episode dedicated specifically to family history. So thank you for providing all of this. And at least in America, I don't know about in Australia, but November is Family Health History Month. So certainly our Thanksgiving is the third week. And so oftentimes people are seeing relatives they may not normally be seeing. So if you are in that group of people, or you just are elsewhere in the world and going to be seeing family, think about these questions and start collecting information and ask, is anybody diagnosed with conditions from earlier ages than you would expect, or anything that we talked about with multiple miscarriages, stillbirth, infant death, congenital birth differences, defects. So all this is really important, to keep track of. And we joke that family health history is the best genetic test, which, probably whole genome sequencing will replace that at some point. But I think, there's something to be said for that. I think it's one of the best genetic screening that people kind of don't think about in that way. But thank you so much, Dr. Hardy, for coming on and really just allowing me to geek out about family history in the prenatal setting, because as I said, this is what I talk about every day. So it's nice to talk about with someone that is even more of an expert than I am. So thank you so much, Dr. Hardy.
Thank you very much for having me.
Are you a genetic counselor or genetic counseling student? Want to enter to win a $100 Amazon gift card? Participate in a quick survey this November to capture your insight on clinical trials. The goal of this study is to assess if, how, and when genetic counselors discuss clinical trials within their practice and document their process. Also, the researchers will look to define a framework for current genetic counselors to incorporate clinical trials into their own practice. It only took me about 15 minutes to fill it out. The link to the survey is in the show notes if you're listening to this in a podcast app, or available in the blog post for this episode at dnatoday.com. The principal investigator, Derek Ansell's email can be found there as well for questions you might have. For more information about today's episode, visit dnapodcast.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. We encourage your questions, comments, guest pitches, and ideas. Send them all into info@dnapodcast.com. Search DNA Today on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, so you can connect with us there. And a favor, please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allow more genetic nerds like yourself to find the show. DNA Today is hosted and produced by myself, Keir Dineen. Our social media lead is Corinne Merlino. Our video lead is Amanda Andrioli. Thanks for listening, and join us next time to discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me are all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA.